Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everybody is able to hear me.
Good morning, I can hear you.
Those online, please, are you able to confirm?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Yes, we hear you.
Thank you. So my name is Tobias Okeno. I'm from Egerton University, a lecturer in the Department of Animal Science, and also the Executive Secretary for ABNet. I think most of you, we have communicated through the email. So today you are able to see my ugly face physically. So I would like to welcome you to ABNet inaugural training, which we have been planning for some time. So the D-Day has come, and I hope it is a training we are going to enjoy and learn a lot through the 3 weeks. Just before I welcome Professor Kai, who will open the training, I have some housekeeping issues to put across. One, to all participants, that make sure that always your microphone is muted so that we don't have the background noise, which can interfere with our colleagues. Then also you can, if you like, you can always have your video on or off, depending on your internet, how stable it is. And on the list of participants, always make sure that you change your login with your name, because I could see some people with the HP and all that. It will be difficult to know who has attended and who has not attended if you have not changed your name. Otherwise, with those few remarks, I would like to welcome Professor Kai, who will open the session and also introduce the teaching faculty. Yes, Professor Kai.
Good morning. For those in the US, good midnight. For those in Africa, in Europe, good morning. Those in Asia, good day. And you heard from the Executive Secretary that I'd like to go through all those protocols. You know, we are in Africa, and that is what we do. So let me recognize the presence of the Executive Secretary. I can see he's smiling, of our very important association, the African Animal Breeding Association. And then let me also take this opportunity to recognize the presence of all founding members and members of ABA. I've seen that they've really joined us online. And then I'd like also to recognize the presence of all facilitators from all over the world. And I will have an opportunity to introduce them during this session, that is before 9 a.m. Kenyan time. So let me also recognize the participants, ladies and gentlemen, and all protocols observed. And I'd like to start by welcoming you to this very important session of this ABNet inaugural training on animal breeding and genomics. And you are all aware that we are currently at Egerton University, and we are very glad to host those online, all of us, and we are more than eager, and I know, to learn and also to grow our knowledge to drive a long-term impact in society. And it is a really great pleasure to see very many faces. And these are both new faces, and then some of the faces that and the names that I can see, they are very familiar faces. And those familiar faces are aging faces. I don't want to give examples, but since they are familiar, it means they are old, just like me. and they're showing an undying zeal. They want to learn and also expand their pools of knowledge in animal breeding and genomics, and with the interest of making sustainable gains towards genetic improvement in this great continent of Africa. Now, as we go into this introductory session, I understand that for the coming 3 weeks, all of us are going to be learners. And speaking for myself, I've decided to be engaged as a beginner. Someone might think that you are a professor and because of that, you're supposed to be knowing everything. In real sense, they say professors, they know nothing. So what I've decided to do is to assume that I've not even graduated with a master's and there is nothing I know. And I'm really looking forward to also deepen my own pool of knowledge during the next 3 weeks of this course. And making it to this training for the participants and for all of us, it has not been that easy. And let me take this opportunity to congratulate all of you for making it through the rigorous selection process, and also for beating all odds to attend this training. And it has not been possible for many to get a slot to attend. And let me once again take this opportunity to congratulate all our participants, and these congratulations are in order. And I only urge us to take up that responsibility to ensure that after these 3 weeks, that we transfer the knowledge that we are going to acquire for the good of all the other scientists within our respective countries. And I also expect that after acquiring this knowledge, we will use it to steer the dream of supporting sustainable livestock genetic improvement in Africa. And I once again take great pleasure at my level now to extend a personal welcome to all of us. And I would also like to commend us for investing time and also to commend us for investing resources in preparation for a packed and very packed 3 weeks of rigorous, very rigorous, yet insightful learning. And it is encouraging and very encouraging to see so many eager, and I can see all those names. I see some of them on publications. And they're very eager and very energetic young animal breeders, and with that burning desire to support sustainable livestock improvement in Africa. The program, as you might have noted, that is planned for us is very, very insightful. And this program is full of very exciting content whose value of beyond anyone of us imagine. And just for your information, a lot of planning and resource mobilization has gone into seeing this day come to fruition. And a lot more will go into seeing the forthcoming weeks generate the value we have all been longing to tap into. And it is because of this reason that I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the organizers and all the stakeholders for following through with your promise. It was not easy, and also for seeing to it that this training is there despite all those challenges surrounding COVID-19. You remember initially it was supposed to have been a physical, but because of issues surrounding COVID-19, the organizing committee decided that let this be our part one of the training and let it be online. And then we are also thinking of a part two of the training. As the world opens up, then that will be a physical training. So let me take this opportunity to thank ABBA. And I see the executive secretary is here. It's a very big name, Dr. Tobias Okeno. And I'd also like to take this opportunity also to thank Professor Apollinie Jenkins. Hope I'm pronouncing that name well, Jenkins, from the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health. And for going out of his way also to mobilize resources that we are currently using. And I'd like also to take this opportunity to also thank the team that organized this course. I think you are aware it's always not easy to organize a course of this magnitude that involves facilitators from different regions of the world. And let me also extend gratitude to all ABBA founding members and also to all ABBA founding institutions and also to ABBA members. And some of the founding members, I think you might be aware, will also be facilitating this, this very important course. And we all have an opportunity. We'll have an opportunity to introduce all the facilitator of this course after I've just made my remark. So fellow scientists, as we go into a rigorous period of learning, let me take this wonderful opportunity to urge us to think how we can drive a sustainable impact on livestock genetic improvement for the long-term development of Africa. And we're looking at this long-term development long after the training ends. And I know that among us sit the drivers. When I look at the names, I'm just happy in this session, we have the drivers of change. And the outcomes of this training, I believe, will have far-reaching benefits if we commit it in ourselves. Now, as I conclude, I'm very, very excited and willing to learn. And also I'm willing to grow my knowledge, especially at this time. For the last 5 years, I was in administration. So I think this training course is coming at the right time, because I will also use this opportunity to ensure that I'm up to date when it comes to matters to do with animal breeding and genomics. So I will also use this opportunity to grow my knowledge, Tobias. And I also believe that we'll be so much better than we started, because I know there is so much in store for us. So before I take this opportunity to introduce the faculty, let me once again welcome you to this ABNet inaugural training. And I hope that you are all looking forward to a fulfilling learning experience as I am. In Kenya, we always say asante sana, and welcome once again to Egerton University, and let us enjoy ourselves during the coming 3 weeks of this training. So at this particular point, I will use this opportunity, if I'm allowed, just to introduce the faculty. And I'd like to request the faculty who are currently with us, if you can put your videos on so that the participants can see your face. And what I will do, I will simply call your name. There is no order I'm using, but since we have our first facilitator, so be forced to start with the Professor Mizek Chagunda. Professor Mizek Chagunda, can you switch on your, okay, that is Professor Mizek Chagunda. And Professor Mizek Chagunda is the chair and the head of Department of Animal Breeding and Husbandry in the tropics and subtropics at the University of Hohenheim, Germany. And when you talk about the University of Hohenheim, Chagunda, you should be saying "Hoi," because that's also my alma mater. In fact, it's in the same institute that I was when I was doing my PhD. So I'm happy to see you, Professor Chagunda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Looking forward to being here.
Thank you. And then I've got the next one is a good friend of mine, Dr. Enyu Neguse. Dr. Enyu Neguse, I saw your face somewhere. Yeah, there you are. Dr. Neguse, can you just shout a little bit?
Hi, good morning. Good morning.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We just wanted to pin you so that people can see.
Yes.
So Dr. Enyu Neguse is a livestock geneticist and a senior scientist at the Natural Resource Institute, Finland. They call it LUC. And I remember we spent some time, we were together with Dr. Neguse at the ILRI, and we did some very good work. I really miss my stay at ILRI, but how many years ago? Around 20 years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah, good, thank you. Okay, the next Professor Rafael Murode. Professor Rafael Murode, are you in the house? But if he's not there, yeah, I think we are all aware of the prof. I remember when I first saw the book Linear Models, and then I saw the name, to me what came to my mind was that this was maybe a European or an American somewhere who did the book and what. But when I met him, I was really surprised. Yeah, so he's the brain behind that very important. Students always complain that the book is difficult. That very important book on linear models. And Professor Rafael Murode is a professor of quantitative genetics and genomics at the Scotland Rural College in Edinburgh. And he also holds a joint position as professor of quantitative genetics and genomics at the Scotland Rural College, United Kingdom, and the principal scientist in quantitative dairy cattle genetics at the International Livestock Research Institute here in Kenya. And then next, there is Professor Apollinaire Jikens. Are you in the house? Okay, Professor Jikens is the chair of the Tropical Agriculture and Sustainable Development and the current director of the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health at the Roslin Institute, University of Edinburgh. You'll be able to meet him. He'll be here physically, I'm told, maybe on Tuesday or Wednesday. And then the next, we have Dr. Victor E. Olori. Dr. Olori, are you in the house? If you are in the house, can you switch on your video, please? Okay, so Victor is a senior geneticist at the Avian Gen Global in Edinburgh, UK. Next, we have, I don't know whether he's awake, my other friend from the other part of the world, Professor Samuel E. Agre. Professor Samuel E. Agre from the University of Georgia. That is the Richard B. Russell's Endowed Chair and Professor at the Department of Poultry Science, University of Georgia, Athens, Georgia in the US. And then we have another faculty, Dr. Chinyere Ekine. Dr. Chinyere Ekine, are you in the house? Yeah. So can you just, yeah, good. There you are. Good, thank you. So Dr. Chinyere Ekine she's a scientist and statistical geneticist at the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, in Nairobi, Kenya. So thank you very much. And then we have Dr. Esido Huaga. Dr. Esido, are you in the house, please? Yes.
Hi, everyone.
There you are. Good. So Dr. Esido Huaga is a research scientist of molecular biology and biotechnology, and from the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health, University of Edinburgh, UK. And then last, but not least, so how will we see your face, Tobias? No, we want to see your face. So last but not least, there is Dr. Tobias Okeno. And Dr. Tobias Okeno is the executive secretary of ABA, and also a lecturer at the genomics department of animal sciences, faculty of agriculture at Egerton University. So when you look at the faculty, I think this, I would say, is the creme de la creme when it comes to matters to do with animal breeding. So participants, you are very lucky that you'll be handled with the creme de la creme. And as I had mentioned earlier, I'm also assuming that you're also the creme de la creme. So you can imagine the two creme de la cremes coming together. You can imagine what that will do as far as a genetic improvement of livestock in Africa is concerned. So let me once again say that I'm happy that we've been able to organize this training course. And as we had mentioned earlier in our communication, this is just the first. And as we proceed on, we'll be having even more trainings in future. So thank you very much. And let me hand over this session to the Executive Secretary of the African Animal Breeding Association.
The problem with that is we end up carrying all these animals, which are still producing a lot of methane, because that's the biology of them. They do produce methane as ruminants, and they're not effectively producing what humans are looking for. So you end up with this huge carbon footprint from these animals. The other thing, of course, is that because of all these inefficiencies, on the continent, we find that very few countries perform routine genetic evaluations, even when they want to, even when you have colleagues who are really willing to do it, but they are not doing it because there's no data, there's no infrastructure. But actually, those are symptoms of a problem that should be there long time before we start seeing no data at all. They are just symptoms of this whole system that's not working effectively. And then what happens with all these inefficient systems? We end up with huge yield gaps. So this example here is work that Joram Macharo and others worked on. Okeo Mai also produced some of that work through the project that EOE undertook in East Africa, so in Kenya and Tanzania. And this graph here is very interesting because we can actually see that they were looking at 3 genotypes. They had, and this is dairy, by the way. They had exotic breed, which is represented in yellow, and the crosses, which is burgundy, and the indigenous in purple. They described 3 production environments. Of course, in the harsh environment, there were not exotic cattle, but you can actually see that in the harsh environment, the crossbred and the indigenous are producing almost at the same amount of yield per year, per day. That was yield. I guess that's per year, liters, or per lactation. But moving on from the harsh environment to the poor environment, the crossbreds are actually doing better than both the indigenous and the exotic. Whilst in the good environment, or improved environment in that case, the exotics are actually doing much better than both the crosses and the indigenous. This is not surprising, is it? Because the good environment is becoming more appropriate for the exotics than the poor environment. But what this is also demonstrating is that if you give these animals what they need, you will have much better performance than when you don't give them what they need. So there is that whole big gap there based on the production system. And it's the same with the crosses. There is that gap there. So inefficiencies in the production systems or defining the production system are leading to leaving different genotypes and different genetics in terms of individuals in an appropriate environment, leading to those yield gaps. And those yield gaps, like I said, one of the results is we end up with a lot of carbon footprints of these animals and not contributing to sustainable development, not contributing to human nutrition, not contributing to economic development. So you end up really with our policymakers even arguing, what are you animal breeders doing? Your animals are not contributing to the economy. Yeah, and we are trying to do a lot of things, yet those animals are actually not performing just because we did not take time to define where exactly those animals should be in. So
There is a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if we go back to the slides, I was looking at the breeds, but I was looking at indigenous because when there was environment which was good and poor, I'm seeing the production is almost the same. So I don't know whether this work it looked at also individuals, because if you remember earlier on we said breed types as well as individuals. So I don't know whether there was some variation within the indigenous when we change the environment from poor to good. I wanted to find out.
Yep. Very good question, actually, because indeed I did not discuss those indigenous. To answer your question straight, I don't know if this work looked at individual performance as the way we described it, but obviously they collected individual data or data from individuals. Now, two things that you are highlighting though in that question. One, that indigenous group, even in this illustration, it may not have been statistically different, but at least we can see that the indigenous in harsh environment are producing lower than the indigenous in good environment. So even the indigenous are obeying that rule of give me good production system, I'll produce better. Yeah. Although in this case, it might have not been allowed. But the second thing that you are highlighting, though, in that question is we can see the differences are not that much. What's happening to these indigenous? So, yes, there is individual variation, which may be contributing to that difference. But when you give them good environment, they are producing better. But the other thing that is highlighted here is that we are forcing the indigenous to do something they are not selected for, or they are not purposed for. So in this case, we can see that actually these indigenous that were used in this population or in this study, they are not delicate. And sometimes actually that's the other thing that we don't really spend time on. What are these animals really able to do? And in this case, I would actually say that these indigenous are not delicate. So even when they are given good environment, they are not producing as much. And remember that what animals are doing when they're actually milk. So the high producing breeds, we've almost bred them, cheating them that your calf requires so much milk per day. And then they are obeying that, biologically speaking, obeying that by producing a lot of milk. Yeah. Whilst the indigenous are producing enough for the survival of the calf and also to make sure that they themselves survive, because what they are bred for, although it's not active selection, is actually adaptation and survival in that environment. So they are keeping their reserves for survival. They are keeping their reserves, energy reserves for adaptation, for disease resistance. And hence why they are not bothered to spend that energy pushing it into milk, because they have produced enough for the calf. So the second thing that this graph is highlighting is that issue of who and which are the appropriate species or breeds to be used for what environment and also for what purpose. Have I answered your question? Thanks so much. I can still hear that echo, so whoever is not speaking, maybe just mute your microphone. That would also be good for the quality of recording that's happening, so that we can listen. At least those who want to listen, I will not listen to my own voice. Those who might have missed this, and may have opportunity to listen. Now, I've talked quite a lot about these farming systems. I would like to spend the next, say, 20 minutes or so talking about what exactly these farming systems are. I will not go bullet by bullet defining what a system is, what a farming system is, and all that, but what I will indicate is that we are talking about a system. It's a collection of elements. It's not one element. So even a livestock production system is not an element. It's not just about the management on the farm. It's about the bigger picture of what the farm is doing, what the other things on the farm are doing. So if we look at a mixed livestock crop livestock system, it's also important actually to start looking at what's happening on the whole farm. Because if we look at a lot of successful animal breeding in the world, although it's taking place on mixed farms, so if we look at New Zealand, if we look at Australia, if we look at Europe, if we look at North America, a lot of successful animal breeding, even when that farmer is producing crops and livestock, which happens quite a lot, there is a primary product they are aiming for, which if you speak to a farmer, a dairy farmer in Germany, and they are planting maize on the farm, they will still tell you I'm a dairy farm. The maize on the farm, the crops are servicing the animals. This is very important when we start looking at our own production systems. The functions start becoming very different. So if we go to a smallholder dairy farmer in Chipata, Zambia, for example, and talk to that farmer, are you a dairy farmer? He may say, yes, I'm a dairy farmer, but actually when you start spending time with that farmer, you see that the crops are not just servicing the animals. To a big component, the animals are actually the ones servicing the crops. So it's a completely different dynamic. And also the interaction of the functions of the crops and the livestock are completely different. So much as we are starting to define these production systems as in a standard textbook scenario, we should also realize that they are context specific. And we should always take that into consideration, that if I go to West Africa, the production system may be a mixed livestock crop system, but the interactions may be completely different. The elements in there may be playing completely different roles or parts in the host farm system. So one of the things I always want to mention when I present these definitions is, let's take them in the context they are applying and not just use them as they've been defined in the books. Because even the things like the boundary around that system is usually subjective. So a very quick example is, we talk about smallholder farmers. That's where my small is coming from. We talk about smallholder farmers and large-scale farmers. But where is the boundary? How small is small? How big is big? How large scale is large scale? Most of the time it's actually country specific and also subjective. We could actually be saying, yeah, a smallholder farmer is that one with less than 100 chickens. Yeah, but how about if I have 105 chickens? Am I a large scale farmer? I may actually tell you, no, I'm not. I'm still a smallholder farmer. So these definitions are sometimes, more especially the boundaries, are quite a lot of times subjective, and also they depend on the production goals of that farmer. The other thing is that the elements or the components of the system sometimes have a quantitative connotation, but at times also they are characterized based on the qualitative connotations. So quantitative, I just gave an example of a farmer with 100 chickens. That's a very easy threshold to use, and it's quantitative. But the qualitative kind of element is this a subsistence farm? Is this a commercial farm? So these qualitative elements also come in. And of course, the relationships between the different components. Is it one directional kind of system, or elements relating to each other? So I talked about a mixed farming system, the crops indeed getting manure from animals, and animals are getting residues from the crops. Or is it that all the crops are sold, what the animals are getting back is money that's then used to buy drugs for those animals? So all these kind of relationships and interactions are very important general features to start looking at when you are characterizing a farming system. In Africa, one of the most important things is the function. I have a slide here where I will discuss functions, but you and me all know that animals have a lot of different functions. Even when a farmer says, I'm a dairy farmer, that animal is not just a dairy animal. That animal, them is prestige. And that's why sometimes people go for a specific breed of animals, because they have heard that that breed is the dairy breed. Sometimes it's just the looks of those animals. And these are functions that sometimes we have to understand and take into account. And quite a lot of times they are qualitatively described, but contribute quite a lot to the higher system, and also contribute quite a lot to what's happening on the farm, as an example. So this prestige thing, as an example, is something that we can't really put a money value on, but the farmer may actually be valuing that quite a lot. You give them a goat, a salmon goat that produces 5 liters of milk a day, and give them a Holstein Friesian cow that produces 5 liters a day of milk, they may actually go for the Holstein Friesian, because in their society, goats are not dairy animals, or goats are not for adults, they're for children. So understanding all these qualitative things, which create the general features of the farming system, is always an important thing. And of course, the performance and requirements of the system and its functions is also a very important thing, because that relates to sustainability of the system. So obviously, if the system is not performing based on the required expectations, farmers will change. And these changes sometimes are very common, sometimes they are rare, at times they are structured, and at times they are very random. And that has to be taken into consideration as well. It's not just about the biophysical issues around the system, it's also about the socioeconomic issues. So in terms of biophysical, most of the time we can quantify those things very easily: the climate, so agroecological zones, land size, water availability, whether it's in an arid environment or a semi-arid environment, or maybe you are in a humid environment, all that kind of natural source-based biophysical characterizations. We can do that, they're easy, but at times it's actually the other things that are very subtle that we also need to take into consideration. For example, the availability of science and technology. How much research investment is done in that country or on the continent? So as an example, the contribution of EO to different training courses in Africa, we can easily forget that. But actually, most of us, after going through universities, we've been associating with that institution, and we've actually gotten quite a lot of knowledge from that. That contributes to the production environment. that at times we kind of forget. ABNet is now trying to do the same thing. I hope we can do this together to improve on human resources, science and technology, so that we can have the capacity. And all this capacity is part of the production system. Some of you have had to answer 2 different questionnaires of 2 different groups working on the capacity of animal breeders in Africa, where the data are. All of that is actually characterizing the production systems. What do we have? What's the status quo? It's all production systems description in the different countries. So don't get tired when you get another questionnaire. It's part of the whole thing. The other thing, though, is the market. I'm aware of the fact that now there's a lot of good talk about linkages in the markets in Africa. That, again, is a big driver. And you can actually look at it from the continent point of view, you can look at it from the country point of view, you can look at it from a district point of view. But all these drivers are determinants of what the production system will be. Policies, very important. And when it comes to policies, most of us go back and look at the agricultural policies. We go back and look at the economic policies. How many of us have looked at the health policies of our countries? When actually, when you think about it, agriculture and livestock contributes quite a lot to the health component of every country. You and me give lectures and we talk about the contribution of livestock and the contribution of livestock in things that crop-based foods don't contribute to. As an example, when we talk about hidden hunger, so the lack of microelements in and we know that the deficiencies in vitamin B12 have a lot of drastic consequences because it actually is very involved in metabolism and also nerve transmission. And yet, when it comes to human health policies, we don't actually look at them. Actually, we should be looking at them because as agriculturists, as animal breeders, we are contributing to the health of the society. Taxes, all the privatization policies and all that. So all these institutional policies, public policies, sometimes we neglect them and we don't look at them, but actually they are part of what we should look at because they are the drivers and determinants of the production systems in that country, or now even in the region, or now even on the continent. Was that a question? There is a comment in the chat. Let me just, quickly pick that. Okay, Ellison is smooth, but he's just introducing himself. So, welcome, Ellison. Now, right, okay. Sorry for that. I actually moved too far. The other driver of these production systems is information. How much information is available? How much human capacity is available? And earlier on, I alluded to the surveys looking at human capacity on the continent in terms of animal breeding is part of all that. And the other thing that you will notice actually in this course is that the organizers did a very good job by trying to pick more than one person per country. That wasn't a random thing. I know that animal breeders like random assortments and all those kind of things. But it was actually by design to have at least 2 people from each country attended this course. Because we realized that information cannot flow from one person to the same person. Information flows between people. And also by having pairs and maybe later teams within countries, we will help build this human capacity that start talking about things that can make the change happen in terms of animal breeding. And also, you have realized that there was a deliberate effort to keep the gender balance. And that was also deliberate in terms of genders, but also, you will also notice that there was an effort to have younger scientists and more senior scientists within the same country, or at least within the group. All that is actually trying to utilize these drivers of production systems so that we can actually start driving the animal breeding agenda together. Now, I want to very quickly go across how FAO classifies production systems. I indicated that yes, there are a lot of qualitative descriptions and all that, but FAO put together some classifications. We will not go through this whole table, but I just want to indicate that at least from an FAO point of view, which was actually work done by Carol Sele and others, indicate that livestock production systems can be divided basically in 2 groups: the sole livestock systems and the mixed farming systems. Then you can actually break them down into landless or grassland-based systems when it comes to sole production systems. The mixed ones can be divided into irrigated systems and rain-fed systems. I would actually argue that most of our production systems are here. And this is because even in the literature, it's indicated that 80% of livestock production in Africa is done on mixed farms. And most of that is also smallholder farms. So that plays a very important role. And you will actually notice that when it comes to setting breeding goals, that has a huge contribution. That has a huge influence. Because in a source system, the farmer is aiming to produce that one product using one animal or one breed. So the source production system, the source pig production system of Denmark, as an example, that farmer is aiming to produce pork. That's it. But so it's easier for that system to have a very clear, easy production goal, a very easy, clear breeding goal. But a farmer who is in a mixed system and is a smallholder farmer with less than 10 hectares of land, and sometimes even less than 2 hectares of land, their breeding goal will become complicated because the functions are completely entangled between the crops and the animals and the functionality of the household. So it is important to note those differences because they actually have implications on the breeding goals. So when it comes to Africa, like I indicated, it's the mixed farming systems that play a big part. but at the same time, it's also either smallholder or large scale. And quite a lot of them are smallholders. And like I said, substantial amounts are actually with smallholders. And that's even been supported by some work which was done by Professor Bebe and others in 2003, and showing that the back is with the smallholder farm. But at the same time, most of these are actually mixed. When we say mixed in this case, they are actually more or less integrated. So the components are actually working together. So sometimes it may even be important to speak to plant breeders as we are trying to improve our lifestyle, to start seeing what's in the plant that can contribute to achieving our goals as animal breeders. I've talked about smallholders. Who are they? These are, like I said, one of the biggest groups of livestock producers in Africa, so they are contributing quite a lot, not only in terms of agriculture, but also food. About 80% of the food supply is actually coming from smallholders. And they come in different shapes and sizes because they could have 10 hectares or less and anything in between. Are we trying to breed an animal for everybody, or are we targeting a specific group? Quite a lot of them use family labor, including young people, like you can see in that picture. They contribute to livestock production. That picture was taken in Ethiopia. And also, they can have structures. So the middle structure, for example, is a house for cattle. Looks very temporary, but then that's important because this production environment changes from one place to the other. It's a temporary environment. How do we capture that as a We've covered most of that already, that some of them have all these short-term, long-term goals. Some of them are temporary, others are permanent. They have different land sizes. And all of this affects the interaction and also the level of intensity. And it is important actually to recognize that, because all that has influence on how we set our breeding goals, how we set that whole cycle of animal breeding. If we don't really get a grip on what's happening at that level, then we can design a very beautiful breeding program that will not actually work in the environment we are talking about. It would be like having a Formula One car on a hilly road that it will not work at all. I suggested that we would take a break in between. Could I suggest that we take a 5-minute break and then we can continue from there? If that's okay with you. Or do you need 10? If we need 10, then I will negotiate for 10 more minutes at the end. But we could do that.
Professor?
Yes, please.
I was suggesting before we take a break, possibly there's some reactions from what you have presented. May have got one. I think one of the components or elements that we haven't worked on, I think when we look at socioeconomic things. So I saw those two options. So we haven't actually put a value that these two oxens, if you do so many crop production system using the oxen, how much does a farmer get? So I think, yeah, the way it is there, you see that at least if we can have a value of how much an oxen or two oxen do. I know there's some work which was done in Malawi and Zimbabwe. So we haven't actually brought it up to encourage farmers so that when they keep your animals, they shouldn't look for them as a meat or selling at that price. But when they use it on a farming system, what are they actually getting from there? Thank you.
So that's a very important comment, and I can't remember which slide that was, but I talked about the relationships being single directional or double directional, and that's part of that. How much these oxen, in terms of energy and labor, are they contributing, and also how much they're contributing in terms of money, all those kind of things. So one of the things about this lecture this morning, I should actually say, is I'm not really going into all the details. We can spend a whole semester looking at the details, but these are indeed important things that you can measure the relationships based on energy, but you can also measure it based on money. Who is contributing to who? And that's the reason I'm actually saying smallholder farms are very complicated. And we need to spend time understanding them, quantifying those things, because they are integrated, but at the same time, they are resource driven. And those resources, where are they going? Where are they coming from? And that's exactly the reason I say we need to start even talking to people who are not animal breeders. So you've given a very good example there. An animal breeder may not quantify the energy uses very well in terms of oxygen. An agricultural engineer may actually be more helpful. Speaking to those people, defining and quantifying these contributions is indeed very important. And you realize that from your study, I haven't read your study, by the way, the one you're talking about, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi. But I can guess that one of the issues that's coming out there may be the thing we discussed about the indigenous breeds. It may be that actually the indigenous breeds are contributing a lot better to draft power than the other breeds. In which case, that contribution should really be accounted for, other than just saying, okay, everybody's looking for milk, and then we start misjudging the indigenous breeds and say, use these terms which I don't like using. People say, oh, the indigenous breeds have low genetic potential. For what? As an example. So you're bringing in a very important point. Let's take a break. We can discuss some more when we are back. Let's be back at, I don't know what the time is on your side, but let's be back 15 minutes after the hour. Hello, should we continue from where we stopped? So for the next 45 minutes or so, what I would like us to do is to look at some specific examples on how production systems do indeed affect different parts of that cycle that we looked at. So we will be concentrating on, we will be concentrating on that cycle that we looked at and looking at specific components. So I have selected only 4 of those components. So how production systems affect the breeding goals, and then of course how we choose the selection criteria and the effect of the production systems on the design of any breeding scheme. And also the last one will be how to disseminate the germplasm that has been developed, how production systems affect that. So these are the 4 parts of this cycle that I would like us to look at. I use some specific examples of some of the work that we've been involved in and also work that others have been involved in. So the first one that I would like us to look at is how these production systems, and specifically the African production systems, and specifically the smallholder mixed systems, affect the definition of the breeding goal. So earlier on, I indicated the multiple functions of livestock in smallholder systems. And this is one of the complications already. When you're defining the breeding goal, how should you account for these multiple functions? I will not give you an answer to that question, but I want you to think about it. The multiple functions of livestock in a smallholder setup may not be something that will be additive. There may actually be trade-offs in those functions. So one of the functions is livestock are kept as a savings account, a living savings account, or an insurance against different catastrophes. In that case, then, it's logical that the farmer will try and accumulate numbers because that's the capital. The sale of animals will only be as and when needed. In that case, then, if you're trying to define a breeding goal for high input, high output, how do you account for this issue of saving and insurance? The other function of livestock in this system is they support these animals contribute to the crops. So earlier on, we talked about the contribution in terms of traction, draft power, manure, funds for the inputs, or funds for buying pesticides and all those kind of things. How do you account for all those in a breeding program or setting up a breeding goal for these livestock? These are important questions to ask, and indeed answers to those may help inform coming up with a much more appropriate breeding goal. Some animals are used for income generation. So more especially when it comes to small animals, chickens as an example. If you are in Ghana, grass cattle as an example, they will be used for income generation. And this does not only mean that these animals will be sold for food, but the bigger ones we talked about traction, it may actually be a service to other farmers. So what you're looking for is an animal that has a lot of stamina, that has endurance. So it's really working much more. Starting to borrow some of the breeding goes for horses, as an example, going into cattle or for donkeys. But also the animals have all these functions like home consumption. So animal products that are used for home consumption. This means that sometimes animals will disappear from the household without warning. Because if they are kept there for one of their functions is to be consumed, we should be aware that the animals that the breeder may actually say, keep these animals, may actually be the first animals to go. So there are all these issues, social cultural activities, all these functions are there and they work for or against animal breeding goals. And it's important to start to really look at it from the context of that specific country, the context of that specific society, in order to come up with appropriate breeding goals. Pastoralism is one system that a lot of us discuss, very extensive. They thrive on moving from one place to the other, so mobility is a crucial part of management. But actually, one of the things that a lot of us don't discuss in terms of pastoralism is the important contribution of pastoralism to land use. The rangeland management in a lot of the countries that practice pastoralism depends on those pastorists. Just the same way, if you look at a mixed system, a sedentally mixed system, the crops, depending on the livestock. This time it's only that it's extensive. The plants, the rangeland, is depending on the livestock. How do we account for this ecosystem service that the animals are contributing to? It is an important part of how we should start thinking about the breeding goals for those animals as they are contributing to the ecosystem services. The other thing that is important to consider when we are actually looking at these smallholder systems is that they don't operate in a vacuum. They operate as part of society and part of the development agenda. And when you start looking at the development agenda for different countries, in general, they are always changing. This graphic here is showing in general how in a lot of countries in the tropics, subtropics, and even in Europe to a certain extent, the priorities for development have been changing, and more especially the priorities for livestock development. If you go into the literature and look at the indicators of livestock production before 1950, you see that most of it was about maximizing output rather. So it was about maximization. And then when you start looking at the same literature from the 50s to the 90s, you actually see that quite a lot of it is about productivity. The word productivity started coming into the literature. It's not just about increasing one trait and having the maximum amount of yield in terms of milk or eggs or meat. It's about productivity. Several traits starting to be considered. Moving on from the 1990s to 2000, the word sustainability started coming in quite a lot. So how sustainable is the production system? How sustainable are these animals? So the strategies started really becoming on sustainability. Moving on from 2000 to very recent, maybe 2-3 years ago, quite a lot of discussion was on interconnections. So the value chain started really becoming the buzzword. Everybody, everywhere I went, every workshop you attended, somebody would produce the word value chain. And we even started having value chain experts. The past 2 years, things are changing. Ethical production systems are now coming in. The word ethics is coming in into livestock, and the issues of agroecological production systems are coming in. Organic livestock production is coming in. All these changes in the bigger picture will still have an effect on what's happening with the farm. What kind of animal the farmer will keep and what kind of market they will be servicing. So there are changes that are happening on the farm, but also these bigger changes that are always affecting what's happening within the region, what's happening within the country, what's happening with the bigger systems. In that sense, all these will affect what's happening on the farm. And it is important that as we are thinking of defining breeding goals, we start looking at these issues together and say, how then will our animal contribute to that? That's a very quick run through on how production systems are affecting the designing of or defining of breeding goals. Any comments before we look at the effect on specifically looking at the selection criteria? So in terms of the selection criteria, we actually realize also that the actual traits to be selected for are very important. So we have the breeding goal, but we also need to define the criteria. This study here, which was done by my late colleague, Aluna Chawala from Tanzania, who happened to be my PhD student, looked at, this was a meta-analysis of what traits were being frequently analyzed in literature in Africa. So he looked at a 10-year window and studied 64 studies that were published and did a meta-analysis. At the end of the day, 38 studies were included in that study. So this was analyzing what you guys, researchers, had been writing on in Africa in terms of dairy, which traits were being researched a lot more. Our hypothesis was actually that a lot of work would be talking about milk yield, because when it comes to dairy, that's what everybody talks about, milk. But actually, surprisingly, it was calving interval that was coming out again and again and again and again. So, although everybody was talking about yield as a goal, but actually, one of the main selection criteria that was being, a lot of people were researching on was actually fertility of those animals. So fertility is, or at least from this study, is one of those selection criteria that's been talked about, that's been really looked at a lot, because calving interval was our first one. The third one was age at first calving, again, fertility. And then, of course, milk yield was the second. Lactation length was fourth. Lactation length is an interesting one because that's a combination of fertility and yield. That was then, after that we started seeing traits like disease resistance. but again, days open, fertility comes in. So fertility seems to be one of those that really is coming strongly in as far as dairy production in Africa is concerned. Looking specifically though, at one study that was done in Tanzania, again by Aluna, we did a choice experiment in the lowlands, in the coastal areas, taking two different agroecological zones. So the highlands ones were actually high up in the Arusha area, and then the coastal ones at the sea, at the coastal region. We looked at whether they were intensive production or extensive, and asked them what were the traits of importance. And what I have here are the rankings. Interestingly, farmers in intensive systems in the highlands were actually the only ones that indicated they wanted high milk yield. The coastal farmers, even when they were intensive, they were actually looking for fertility. Their number one trait was fertility. The extensive ones in the highlands, their number one trait was disease resistance. In the coastal area, their number one trait was temperament. They wanted a cow that they could handle and work with. Nothing to do with milk yield, nothing to do with disease resistance, but an animal I can work with is the animal I want. Now, this is interesting because without really going deep into finding out what the farmers are looking for, we can start assuming that a dairy farmer is there to produce milk. But actually, a dairy farmer may be there to produce milk, and yet they want an animal that is of less temperament, high disease resistance, and then that animal will produce milk for them. So it is important to consider the production systems when it comes to defining exactly the traits to select for. Any questions or comments? I know that I've condensed two studies that took Aluna a lot of time into a very brief discussion there, but I hope that gives you an idea of where we're coming from. If there are no questions or comments, let's move on to the effect on designing the breeding scheme itself. So in that, I will talk about 3 points. The first one is the effect of production systems when it comes to establishing foundation population, and also on planning mating, and of course gene flow, who will be the sire, who will be the dam. And I'll also talk about response to selection. So what I'll start with is in terms of establishing a founding population. One of the studies we had several years ago now, 4 years ago, was to study the Girinka program in Rwanda. The Girinka program is the one cow the poor family program, where the government profiled everybody in the country, and the poorest households were being given a cow. They are still being given a cow. Now, our question was, in this study, can this kind of development program be used as starting a foundation population for a breeding program? We interviewed 3,000 farmers across 5 districts of Rwanda, and we collected hair samples for genotyping. Now, the results I'm showing here is the results of the PCA we did with looking at the Rwanda population, which are the pink ones, against other breeds. So you can actually see that those here are the zebu, and here are much more the dairy-specific breeds. So Western Frisian, Guernsey, Jersey are in there. We also had Linda as part of the study of the reference populations, and it was interesting to see the smallholder farmers had quite a variety of genotypes, ranging from some that were very close to the zebu to others that were very close to the specific dairy breeds, but with a lot of crosses in between. So indeed, there is a lot of variation that can be used as a founding population. But all this is coming in, not because breeders were putting things together, but because development workers were putting things together. So understanding the country, understanding the production system, understanding the policies. This policy was not about let's breed more animals or let's improve the animals. The policy was about poverty alleviation. And yet we can actually see that it's contributing to the genetic variation that can be used as raw material to start a breeding program. The interesting thing though, within the same study, we asked the farmers the simple question on what they thought the breed of their animal was. So not what they thought, but actually what the breed of their animal was. That's what they believed. And we also did breed identification using DNA. Interestingly, only 47% of those data agreed. So the problem is that when it comes to creating the foundation population, my take would be don't utilize all the information that you get from the production system, from the qualitative descriptions, rather also get into the science of it. Spend a bit of time collecting data, collecting samples, and do proper genetic analysis. Because if you just take the weight of what the extension worker or the farmer themselves, in this case the farmer, believes that breed is, you may actually start saying we have a foundation population of crossbreds, when actually some of them are not crossbreds at all. Or they may be not half-half, they may be three-quarter, or even quarter of what breed they are believing in. And so combining what the description is being given at the production system level and science would be my take on this, because that will affect how you create the foundation stock. This example here is again coming back to the same point on moving on from the same point of the foundation stock to the planning and gene flow. We had a different study, and this was done by, again, a former PhD student of mine, Dr. Opola. She collected data from two different countries, Kenya and South Africa, and these were Holstein Friesians, and looked at the breed structure. Interestingly, there are quite a lot of records, at least this wasn't smallholder farming anymore, this was medium scale and large scale. And they're using quite a variety of science. In this data set from Kenya, they have used 1,700, about 1,740 sites, whilst South Africa 925 sires. And we can actually see that there's a lot of differences there in terms of which sires are used where. But the interesting thing was that on average, a sire in Kenya only had 5 daughters, whilst sires in South Africa, on average, they had 29 daughters. This is interesting because the choices of which sires to use sometimes don't depend on the farmer, they depend on the middleman, and they don't depend on the breeders, the government policy of breeders. It's actually the artificial inseminator, the guy in between. And most of the time, we actually take the artificial inseminator out of the breeding group. We actually think that they're just AI technicians, but actually they are making the vital decisions on who mates with who at local level. And it is important to understand that breeders value chain as well in order to look at how this production system affects the mating system. Moving on from these data, just taking a step back, countries like Malawi, they have been training artificial inseminators at government level, but they are not enough. What they're doing is to train farmers. So they are having what are called farmer AI technicians. They are within the society, but those who also make a lot of decisions that will affect the dissemination of the genotype into the society as well. So it is very important to understand this value chain as well. It may be very short, the breeder's value chain, but it's part of the production system. Getting back to the Kenyan example and South African example worked by Dr. Opola, Oloinka Opola, we'll see that actually at large scale and medium scale level, countries are sharing the same genetic material. Kenya and South Africa in this study, at least 192 sires had daughters in South Africa and had daughters in Kenya as well. And these sires were coming from all sorts of places. And you can see USA contributing quite a lot to the genetics, at least when it comes to hosting freezing in those two countries. The second one was Canada, and of course, Great Britain. I can assure you that the chicken is not coming from my side. I would have loved to be on a farm, but I'm not on a farm today. So anyway, getting back to that, we can actually see that gene flow is being influenced by the same genetics. That was about Holstein Friesians, but the story is almost the same with Jersey cattle. Again, looking at South Africa and Kenya, 31 sires in this study shared common daughters, or daughters in Kenya and South Africa shared common parents. They had common sires. So there is actually a lot of sharing of genetic material between countries. These are only examples of Kenya and South Africa, which, when you think about it, that's extreme south and somewhere in the east, and they are sharing genetic material. Earlier on, there was the question of a study that was done in Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe. I'm pretty sure if we started looking at dairy farms in those countries, they are also sharing quite a lot of genetic material. So understanding that is very important for making sure that we can get a good story out of how to plan for what to select for. The last thing I want to discuss in terms of designing of the breeding or defining of the breeding program is the selection intensity and also the genetic progress that's made. Now, this graph here represents a normal free mating population, random free mating population, like we always do in animal. You have a population with the average production, which is the yellow line there, that's our population mean. And of course, within that population, you get some animals that you want to select. Now, when it comes to the animals you want to select, they are the top, let's call these the top 10% or top 5%, whatever it is. They have their own mean in there. And from that, we can calculate the selection intensity based on the selection differential. Simple, straightforward. We've all done this. And then we can actually look at response to selection, which is the difference between the mean performance of the selected population, so mean of the selected, versus the mean of the original. We've all looked at this. But what happens with smallholder farmers? When you start looking at the data from smallholder farmers, you realize that actually this graph is distorted. To start with, the distribution really gets very squashed together. That's the reason you get a lot of populations that are producing the same amount of milk, as an example. So you collect data, and the average is 5 liters of milk plus minus 2 liters. Very squashed together. So the whole population is actually performing as almost a few individuals. In which case, that classical graph really gets squashed together. In that case, then, when you select your population as the next generation, you end up with these two means together. That's the reason we end up with response to selection that's usually not very encouraging. It's because the population is actually almost operating as one. So even with a bit of selection in there, we are not really achieving a lot. What does this mean in real life? This means that we are ending up with the phenotype really not changing over a long period of time. So most of the performance is in the E, the environment. The genetics are not being expressed. Which then, when you also look at the heritability values, we end up almost always with a very low heritability value, even for traits that you expect to have high heritability values. It's because the performance environment is really squashing everything together. And that's one thing we need to start working on to make sure that the genetics that we are dealing with are expressing themselves. Because otherwise, we would try and do a lot of good genetics work and not really see the response to selection or the genetic gains that we are looking for. And this can be seen because even when you look at these classical equations, So estimating of the breeding value, for example, if you end up with a low heritability, and also the difference between the performance of the individual and the population is low, the breeding values will always be low, and then you have a population that you can't really select from. So we need to understand that and start pushing the production system to make sure that it helps us express the genetics. So all that was theory, all that was things we've seen, but this is an example of an analysis we did on a living population of Mkapa cattle of Tanzania, again by late Aluna. Even when the heritability value was high, the genetic trend was almost around zero all the time. So this work was for a long period of time, 1967 to 2007, but you can actually see that there wasn't a lot of genetic progress. We should have at least seen an upward trend, but the trend line was very flat. And it's because of all those kind of things that the production environment is not really helping to have the genetics express themselves. This has even effect on the tools that can be used for genetic evaluation. So earlier on, we talked about models as one of the things that we need to have when we are looking at that breeder cycle. I call them tools. So I've lumped all the good models, the animal models, and all those genomic models into tools. The production system also affects those tools that we use. And I have an example of some of the work we did using the African data as well, where things of culture, things of development affect the kind of model that you need to use to capture those aspects, which otherwise you may not actually capture. Obviously, it also affects the data structure and the connectedness of those animals. Just looking at the tools, so this example here was an animal model that we used. When we applied the univariate or even the bivariate animal model, which was simple, which had a season like that, we actually found out that the heritability values were over-exaggerated. We tried to find out and had a lot of discussions to and from Erie that time, and found out that actually we were dealing with a population of animals who, and this is in dairy cattle by the way, who were not spending all their life in one herd. Remember the Pass a Cow program, the One Cow Per Poor Family program? Remember how bride price works? An animal is in one herd until they are a heifer, and then they are passed on to another herd where they are producing. When we accounted for the herd where they were born and they grew up, and also the herd where they are producing, all that exaggerated heritability disappeared. This is because the existing models were dumping all that variance, which wasn't accounted for, not in the error term, but rather in the animal term, because that is associated with the animal. So the model was actually dumping that in the animal, increasing the additive genetic variance wrongly. So the numerator was actually very high and the denominator was small, and then of course you get very high heritability. After all the discussions of finding out which animals grew up where, and we had to go into the database again and found where they were born, where they grew up, and accounted for that. We then had a model that had the herd where the animal was born and the herd where that animal was performing. When we did that, that's the time when we realized that actually the existing tools may not be applicable for some production systems. And these are systems where animals are moving from one herd to the other. So it is important to identify the production system, how those animals are living their life, so that we can actually capture that in our tools, our existing tools. So far, we've covered those aspects. And I would like to finally talk about how then production systems are affecting the dissemination of the germplasm. We carried out another survey, and colleagues like Mujibi were very helpful with this collaboration, really enjoyed it. We ended up with a survey in 4 countries using the same questionnaire. And our PhD student, who is now Dr. Mwanga from Tanzania, did most of the analysis. We had about 2.8 thousand responses from Uganda, 5.2 thousand from Kenya, 4.6 thousand in Ethiopia, and 3.5 in Tanzania. So we essentially covered 16,000 farmers in Eastern Africa. Now, obviously, we had to clean all those data and make sure that everything was according to the standards of analysis and all that. And in some countries, we lost some data, quite a lot than others, but at least we had a decent data set at the end. Now, the interesting thing is, one of the things we were finding out is how do farmers make their decision to use either artificial insemination or to use a bull. I'll only present results from 2 countries. But it was interesting that the driver to use a bull or not to use, the driver to use AI or not to use AI was completely different, or the drivers were completely different in the different countries. So this example here is from Uganda. And in Uganda, if we take this group here as the group that used artificial insemination and follow that route, this analysis was done by Mwanga using some of the machine learning models. But the results are what are important for this discussion. And that group is the group that did not use artificial insemination at all. When we follow those groups, though, we actually realize that the driver for these farmers to use artificial insemination on their animal, for example, the starting point was those farmers that kept records were more likely to use artificial insemination than those that did not. And that's interesting. What causes one? Is it that they have to record level of awareness, level of education, not in terms of secondary school, primary school education, but level of dairy education. How well versed that farmer is with the dairy issues. And of course, so by training the farmers and making them aware of what they need to do with their dairy cattle, helps them adopt artificial insemination. And within that group then, those ones that also had enough feeding were most likely to use artificial insemination other than usable. So again, the level of management, all that points to the production system, as we discussed earlier, education, management, and of course the availability of those animals, or the AI or not, then made them choose. So it's not just the availability of the AI service, it's actually the production environment on the farm, education of the farmer, and also the level of management that makes them adopt AI or not, which is then, of course, how the germplasm gets utilized on the farm. The other example is from Tanzania. When we looked at the Tanzanian group, the driver was different as well. So the first core here was whether the artificial insemination was being provided by a private inseminator or a government inseminator. Again, a production system issue. When the government inseminator was available, most likely they were taking up the artificial insemination. And of course, how well the previous insemination worked versus so prior information about artificial insemination. So all this really pointed to the aspect of the importance of the production system, not the genetics themselves, but rather the production system to utilize the utilization of genetics. I haven't shown you the results we had from Ethiopia, but the main driver in Ethiopia was actually the availability of a market to sell their milk. So when there was a market to sell milk, the likelihood of using artificial insemination was much higher than when there was no market. So it is important indeed to study the production system, and because it affects most of the components of that wheel that we looked at. We just looked at 4 examples, but this really suffices to say there is need to look at the production system more seriously as we are trying to look at designing of breeding strategies. Can we learn from others, is my question. The answer is yes. So a lot of us actually, I'm sorry we have short up our time a bit. I hope you will forgive me if we have another 5 minutes of your time to finish up. A lot of us cite New Zealand as one success story in terms of dairy, and they are indeed a big success story because they even are the highest exporter of powdered milk in the world. Actually, most of the milk they produce, they export. But when you start teasing their breeding goal together apart, you don't tease it together, you tease it apart, you actually realize that they are not talking about yields, they are talking about solids. They are aiming to breed a cow with a certain amount of solids per unit of land. And it's not solids per animal. It's actually solids, milk solids per unit of land, per hectare. That's very interesting because the hectare of land is not genetics, is it? The hectare of land is actually the feeding. So it's actually solids per amount of grass that that animal is eating. In that case, they also involve the plant breeders a lot, so that they breed the grass that is appropriate for the animal. And the artificial inseminators are the ones that, so this screenshot here is actually from one of the breeding companies, LIC. I'm not their salesperson, but I thought it was a good example to use. Even the breeding companies then select animals that are appropriate for that goal. And the application of the breeding, the artificial insemination, is a seasonal artificial insemination. All heifers, all cows, they are inseminated at the same time. And then they do pregnancy diagnosis at the same time. Those that don't become pregnant, they are not given a second chance, they go. So the important thing, though, is actually to realize that it's not just about the animal. It's not just about the animal breeding and setting up that goal. It's the goal that fits the whole system, the whole value chain. That's an important component I think we can learn from New Zealand on how they do their animal breeding. They don't just look at the animal, they look at the value chain, and they look at the market. Where is that milk going? It's actually going out of New Zealand as powdered milk. So they are not really interested in white water, they're interested in the solids. Such that when you start looking at their breeding values and their selection index, there are a lot of traits that go in there, talking about all the functions of smallholder farm animals. But actually, when you turn that around, even in New Zealand, all those functions, of course, they are at animal level, but there are a lot of them. And they are using the economic values of those traits to create the selection index based on the breeding values, of course, and then they are selecting for that. So it is important to look not only at the whole value chain, but also the traits that contribute to that breeding goal. Can this work in Africa? Can we start working together? Can we start having common thoughts? I think the answer is yes. Can we start disseminating the germplasm together? I think the answer is yes, because this work again by Dr. Paula shows that a joint genetic value estimation can work. In this example, which was data from 3 countries, Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, using host and freezers from those countries, we can actually see that when heritability values were calculated at individual country level, they were almost all at the same level, but there were differences there. The joint genetic evaluation, although the heritability value was almost the same, but look at the standard error. The accuracy improved. So there is action, and that's not only in terms of 305-day milk yield values, but also in terms of first lactation milk yield. So there is something that can be done together there. And it doesn't just have to be these 3 countries. We were lucky to get data from these 3 countries that time, but maybe we can be even luckier to get more data from other countries. But the important message is having common goal and working together, bringing data together may actually give us a much better genetic evaluation and much better progress than individual countries would. Because if you look at progress, In this simulated example, using the same data, simulated because then she looked at different cutoff points, top 5%, top 10% sires, you actually realize that by having a joint evaluation, which is this one here, even with the example of these two traits, there is more progress that can be made with joint genetic evaluation than individual country evaluations. So these things are possible to do together. And what we need is to define and describe our production systems together and make sure that ABNet gives us a platform where we can start speaking together, because most of these issues are affecting all the countries in Africa the same way. So, as I finish, and thank you for allowing me to speak longer than allocated time, my thoughts are that we can look back into the past to learn from there, but we shouldn't sit there. We should be looking back at the past in order to look into the future and into the breeding strategy for the future of African livestock should seriously start taking production systems into account so that the genetics work we do can start giving us the values. The other message that I have having going through all this together is that we need to consider using appropriate tools, appropriate models, appropriate science, appropriate approaches on what's relevant to the continent. And of course, this course is supposed to provide us together with tools that should be appropriate enough. And we should be able to question some of the approaches ourselves and say, is that really relevant? Is that really applicable? Will that make us make the difference? And then obviously, it's by working together, just like I've shown with the joint genetic evaluations, that it's working together, disseminating this germplasm together that would really help. And it's not just disseminating the germplasm together, but also even defining the breeding goals, working together to define the production systems, and also the implementation of those breeding activities together, that would be beneficial. I hope with these 3 points I've summarized what I went through today with you as the starting lecture for this course. I hope I've given you a starting point to start thinking of how to apply the tools that we get within this module, this course, and how to take things forward. Any questions or comments? Are people still there? All right, okay. If there are no questions or comments, I take it that this is good food for thought. And let's use that as we move on into the course in the next 3 weeks. Let's engage in the discussion and also seriously think of the production system as part of the breeder cycle. I will see you again at the end. I think in the 3rd week, I have another slot to talk about phenotypes and phenotyping. And if not, then I wish you all the best for now. And looking forward to more interaction. Let me pass back on to Dr. Okeno. Thanks so much and have a good day.